This week's parsha is Parshat Shemot, so we're beginning a whole new Sefer Chumash. But before we get there, I just want to backtrack to last week's dvar Torah about the brothers and the evolution from Cain and Hevel to where Cain killed Hevel, and where God asked Cain, "Where is your brother?" and Cain responded, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And of course, the answer throughout all of Chumash Bereshit is yes, a resounding yes. And we concluded with the beautiful reunion and the getting along of Yosef and his brothers. But actually, there's a further development. I thought of this over a Shabbat, and I had it confirmed amazingly at Surah Shlishit by Rabbi Greenblatt of the Aguda St. Louis. So here's what he said, and here's the Chiddush, that actually the real conclusion of the brothers' story is really by Yosef's sons, Menashe and Ephraim. Menashe was the eldest, and Ephraim, or I guess oldest, and Ephraim was his younger brother. And Yaakov actually gave the preferential blessing to Ephraim, the younger brother. And we might expect Menashe to be very, very jealous. After all, we saw that Yaakov favored Yosef. The brothers were very jealous, and they almost killed Yosef. But here we see no jealousy whatsoever by Menashe. In fact, it's like really a complete revolution, where Menashe sees his grandfather giving his younger brother the preferred blessing, and there's just no tension at all whatsoever about it. We don't hear anything about it. Menashe accepts it, and Ephraim graciously accepts as well. That is to say that he doesn't cause anything to result in more tension with his brother, and that's a beautiful conclusion to the story of the brothers. So there you go. Moving on to less cheerful matters, we have Parshat Shemot, which is really not a very happy parsha. This is based on what I heard from Rav Bernstein 2 years ago. We'll be dealing really very briefly with the details. We cannot get into all the manifestations of this shir. But the idea is this, that Mitzrayim is obviously our first galut, the first times that the Jews went into exile, and we can learn a lot about, in fact, everything about our current exiles and all the future exiles from that point, from this root exile. In the same way that we have Masa Avot Siman Labanim, right? The things that Avram did and Yaakov did, we can see for ourselves. We are the Banim. So too, this Masa Avot of Galut Mitzrayim can be transferred to the future generations of all those Galuyot, including the one we are in now. So it says Rav Bernstein, we see the first pasuk, Ve'ele Shmot Bnei Yisrael Habayim Mitzrayim. And these are the names of Bnei Israel coming into Egypt, who are coming to Egypt. Now, what's interesting that he points out is that Habayim is actually in the present tense, really to be in the past tense. So this alludes to the fact that this is the root Galut, and we're still in Galut. And moreover, if we're to actually dissect the word Habayim, that is an acronym for all of the Galut we were or are in. AKA, Bet stands for Bavel, right? The Bavel and Madai, which was the Galut where the story of Purim occurred. Then there is the Aleph, which is Edom, Rome. That's the one we are in right now. Yud is Yavan, right? Greece. That's the Galut we are in during the times of Hanukkah. And Mem, Mitzrayim, this root Galut. So what do we learn from this? So it says Rav Bernstein, look at verse 8. Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. Right? A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now that's very bizarre, because what do you mean he didn't know Joseph? First, he was the king of Egypt who for sure knew who Joseph was. And second, just in the general context of things, Joseph was probably the most famous person in the past century. He effectively fed the entire world, certainly Egypt and its neighboring countries, and the broader context, especially considering that there was a terrible famine everywhere. So what do you mean that the king didn't know Joseph? So here we see a very important point, that the Jews often come in and they build these amazing institutions, and then, right, and we build and we contribute, and then after that, just the ruling party or whatever pretends that the Jews didn't actually contribute. They did nothing. So here's the first time we saw that, literally. I mean, which is impossible. How did he not know Joseph? And the answer is, he did, but he pretended not to know. Fine. That's symptom 1. Symptom 2, this is also quite disturbing, that the Jews that again, within the context of Yosef, this is based on the Targum here, where it says, "V'kam malka charetz al Mitzrayim," right? A new king rose over Egypt. Jelo mekayim gzerat Yosef, right? Who's not mekayim the gzera of Yosef. So what does that mean? Rav Bernstein explains as follows, because that's slightly different than the psukim. That the king himself, Paro, right, was obviously indebted to Yosef. After all, Yosef effectively built his whole wealth. Yosef is the one who solved Paro's dreams, right? And Yosef is the one who effectively amassed all of this wealth from the Egyptian people to Paro. So everything Yosef did was in service of Pharaoh, of the king. And now this new Pharaoh, be it actually a new Pharaoh or the same Pharaoh but a different take on Yosef, regardless, he wanted to kind of offload this benefit he received from Yosef. So first, not only did he want to not acknowledge the goodness he received from Yosef, but actually, in Yosef acquiring this wealth for the Pharaoh, what did he do? He effectively had to enslave the entire Egyptian people because they had no money, right? And then they ran out of cattle, and then they ran out of everything. So Yosef, as a result, had them all transfer between lands in Egypt, so that they knew that the land wasn't theirs, and therefore they belonged effectively to Paro. So Paro goes to the people and says, "Look, it wasn't me. I'm not the one who made you slaves. I don't want you to be slaves. That was him. It was the Jews. They did it." Now we see things like this where we effectively act, and then it's thrown back into our face repeatedly. After all, Rav Bernstein points out, in the Middle Ages, what happened? The Jews weren't allowed to practice most professions. So what do? We went into finance. And then, of course, it became, you Jews, all you care about is money. Not only that, then they forced us into shtetls and into ghettos, right? We couldn't live anywhere else but there. Then what did that turn into? You Jews, all you do is keep to yourselves. So we constantly see this idea of us kind of acting in accordance with the government regulation, and then having that thrown against us. And we see all of that within this root of Galut Mitzrayim. There are many, many more instances, very many, but we'll have to stop here. And there's one more idea I want to share, which is something more cheerful. It's a Hasidic Shavor. Also, I heard from Rav Bernstein in a different shir, but it was Geshmak. So let's see. So this is chapter 2, verse 11. Right, so we see in those days, Moshe grew up, right? Finally, Moshe Rabbeinu, he's back. He's been raised in an Egyptian home, and then he goes out to see his brothers in their misery, in their agony. And Vayar ish mitri, make ish ivri me'echav. Now, when we say it's a Hasidic Shavor, I reverse and quote this in the name of the Rebbe. We don't know which Rebbe, but a Rebbe. That means that the psukim we're going to depart from, it's a more loose reading of the psukim, but it's an important lesson all the same. So again, the context. Moshe has been raised mostly in an Egyptian home by an Egyptian family, right? He knows the language. He's a prince of Egypt. He obviously has a lot to do with Egyptian culture. And so we see he comes out and he sees his brothers, right, the Jews, suffering. And now we see Vayar ish mitri, make ish ivri me'echav. So the way this Hasidic Shavor goes is he sees this Egyptian man striking an ish ivri, a Hebrew man, a Jewish man, among his brothers. Now, what this means is obviously not in a literal context, but effectively he was looking at himself. He was the Egyptian man, and he was striking the Hebrew man within him. And he didn't know how to resolve the battle. Why? Because most of us, most of our host cultures, we identify with the host culture, right? Be it whether or not we're Canadian or American or Israeli or English or European, South African, whatever it is. We identify with the host culture, and we say to ourselves, we're Jewish, and we're Canadian, American, etc., right? Or we're American first or Jewish second, regardless of that debate, Jewish first. But regardless, we have this tension with our host culture where we don't know exactly how to identify. We identify with both. That's what's happening with Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore, what did he do? So the very next pasuk, V'yifen kol v'cho, right? So he looked here, and he looked there. V'yar ki ein ish, and he saw that there was no man there. That is to say, there was no such thing as a person who's half Egyptian and half Ivri. You're either one or the other. A person that's half-half doesn't actually exist. So what did he have to do? How did he resolve the tension? V'yach et ha-mitzri v'yitmeneu b'chol. So he struck the Egyptian within himself and buried him in the sand. He left the Egyptian part of himself gone. Now keep in mind, this is Moshe Rabbeinu, who grew up as an Egyptian prince, right? Everything lay before him. However, when he went out to see his brothers, he saw his brothers suffering, and he recognized, this is me. And so he killed the Egyptian part of himself. Now, of course, that isn't to say that we're supposed to revolt against our host culture. We're, of course, supposed to grow with it. But the point is that at the core of who we are, we're Jewish. And that's the lesson we see from Moshe. Vayached Mitzri. He struck the Egyptian, and he buried him in the sand. Shabbat Shalom.